start going into startup stuff. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming out tonight, everyone, to Bleeding Edge Web. If you're not here for Bleeding Edge Web, you're in the wrong place. How many people are here for the first time? Anyone? First time? Quite a few. Cool. Well, welcome. And just so you know, our format is every month we start off with the same kind of talk, news from the Bleeding Edge, where either me or usually Corey will kind of give a little roundup of news that would be interesting mostly to web application developer types. So I'll do that this time. And then if we have any lightning talks, we do those, and then we'll have our main talk. And of course, this month we have our analytics and data talk with Lewis here from Fauna. So we'll get to that in a little while. So a little bit of housekeeping. We always do enjoy speakers and sponsors who, come to us and say they have stuff to talk about so that we don't have to beg people to come talk. We've had pretty good luck over the years, and if you have anything that you think would be interesting, come talk to us afterwards and let us know. And speakers, speaking here doesn't mean you have to do some conference style presentation. It could be as simple as a lightning talk on something cool like these guys are going to do later. So always appreciated. Also, if you parked here in the Omni, make sure you get a parking validation from the young lady at the desk there. Otherwise, it will be very expensive when you try to leave. And side note, even with the parking validation, if you don't leave by 10, it will be still very expensive. I've made that mistake a couple of times. Finally, the room here closes at 9, so we have to be out of here around 9. But if anyone feels like hanging around, normally a few of us hang around afterwards and chat. So we usually go downstairs. So feel free to hang around if you would like to do that. So thank you to our sponsors. Capital Factory, of course, gives us this space free of charge, which is very nice of them. So thank you, Capital Factory. And like I mentioned, Fauna this week is our sponsor. So I think, Lewis, did you want to say anything, or do you want to just come up later?
Yeah, Fauna is a really cool NoSQL
Here, let me,
product. Yes.
in case anyone's on the live stream.
Hello. Yes, Fauna is a really cool NoSQL database product. I'm going to be talking a lot more about it later, but suffice to say it's really nice for people working with serverless applications and looking to be part of the bleeding edge of the tech side. So it's pretty cool.
And are you guys hiring or anything like that?
Oh, we're definitely hiring. Fauna.com/careers, and the product is actually free to start using. We have a super generous free tier. So if you want to just try it out, fauna.com.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you, Fauna. We owe all the pizza and drinks and stuff to them, so we appreciate that. All right, so let's jump right into it. News from the Bleeding Edge. We actually had quite a bit of interesting stuff to talk about, so I'm going to kind of breeze through it a little bit, but stop me if you have any questions. So we normally do a little browser check. Anyone know which of these browsers has updated since the last time we talked about them last month? Any guesses on which ones have changed? Chrome, that's always a good guess. So actually we had 2.5, we'll call it. So we'll get to Edge in a minute. But yeah, Chrome and Firefox both had major releases. So Chrome 77 came out. Actually just, what is that, yesterday? I don't know what day it is today. Yesterday or the day before it just came out. Couple of interesting things. So if you do any performance debugging with how your pages render, you know that there's various strategies for that. One of the common ones is first contentful paint. A lot of people use that to measure kind of the first time a user sees something useful on the page. Well, they came out with this new event called largest contentful paint instead of first, because what they realized is that often the first thing to render with content is not actually the main important thing for the user. So this gives a more kind of real world, more realistic way to measure what the user is actually caring about and when that is rendering. So that's pretty useful. They've also added a couple of things for people who are into building custom forms and form components. So there's this new event that you can listen to that you can kind of hook into the submission of the form and actually append custom data to the form data before it gets posted without actually having to do it at the field level. You can kind of do it programmatically in a callback, which is actually pretty cool. And then the other thing they added is this property called form associated. And so that's really useful for things like web components or just any kind of custom component that you might build kind of programmatically, but you want to hook it into the form. And so by adding the static property and providing a few of the expected properties of typical fields like value and name, you can actually make your custom code act just like a field and be recognized by the form as a field, which is really neat. And then this one's pretty simple, but pretty useful if you do a lot of CSS. So in Chrome now, you can inspect an element, and you can come down to anything here. And we've always had copy with various things in there. It's hard to see, I know that. But one new one that they added is this copy styles. And so what's actually really cool about that, let me see if I can just show you real quick. So in Sublime, that's what it copied. So I know that maybe not too impressive to you if you've never had to deal with this, but actually for people who have done CSS debugging, trying to figure out like what properties have actually been applied at runtime to some element, that gives you a super convenient way of doing that without having to kind of go through all the different various class names in the CSS panel. So it's a nice little helper. Cool. They have other stuff too. They always have security fixes and other things, but those were just a few of the notable things that I saw. Firefox 69 came out, and really the big banner news item on this is the privacy release. So we actually talked about this in the last month or two that this was coming, but they finally enabled enhanced tracking protection across the board for everyone by default. This is a huge change actually, and this is sort of a shot across the bow of Google, I guess, and Chrome. But basically, by default, they are blocking all third-party tracking cookies. They're blocking crypto miners, which everyone would want to do that, I guess. You can opt into blocking fingerprinting scripts, which basically try to use lots of variables from the browser and from your session activity to figure out to kind of create a unique fingerprint of you as a person, even if you're not logged in. They also give you an option to block auto-playing media by default. And Flash is now disabled by default. So all of that to say that they're kind of doubling and tripling down on privacy, which is good for all of us as users, but as developers, it's something really to be aware of, because if you are dealing with advertising or if you're dealing with kind of media that might autoplay or just any of these use cases that are touched on by this, something definitely to be aware of and to test out how it's working in Firefox. Along those same lines, in the console, they made specific improvements for that reason, because actually, as you might expect, a lot of sites now throw a lot of errors in the console because of all those reasons, because Firefox actually warns now when you try to make a cross-origin call that's not allowed, or when you try to load from some tracking domain or whatever, they block all that and it throws warnings. So they actually made improvements just to make the console kind of not as cluttered specifically from those changes, which is kind of interesting. And then this one is kind of cool on the JavaScript side. So they added support for public class fields. So it's a little bit subtle, but you can see that those two definitions don't have var or let or const. They're just declared right at the class level. So that actually declares them as publicly available fields, and you can sort of treat them as properties inside your code. But that's kind of a nice syntactic sugar that you have available now. They don't have private fields yet. So if you follow the spec, and Chrome, I think, already implemented this, there's a syntax where you can do the same thing, but with a hash sign in front of it, which makes it a private field, which is kind of cool. They don't support it yet, but that will probably come out soon. Lots more. It was a big release. They always have lots of minor stuff in their dev tools and other things, so check out the release notes. Just a side note, they've been on kind of like a 6 to 8 week release cycle, but they're moving to a 4-week release cycle starting in Q1. So won't change anything from a practical standpoint, other than we'll probably have more regular things to talk about as they release new things. So Chromium Edge, to be honest, their version numbering is a little bit confusing at this point. So, if you follow them at all, it was IE, of course, through IE 11. They switched to Edge, and then their version numbering was always a little confusing because they versioned sort of like Edge HTML, their rendering engine, separately from the JavaScript and the browser part of it. Now, I can't even tell if they're still using numbers or not. They're just calling this one Chromium Edge, basically. And we've talked about this in the past. I'm not going to rehash it, but if you're not familiar, they've actually completely gone away from their own rendering engine and they've adopted Chromium. And they're contributing along with Google to the Chromium project, which you could argue about if that's good or bad. We can save that argument for another day. But at least from a developer standpoint, it'll be easier to support, which is good. So the thing that was interesting was on the 20th, which was, I guess, last month, but it was after our last meetup, they released their first official beta. So they had been on kind of like alpha and preview releases for the last, I don't remember, like 8 months or so. This was the first one that they actually released and presented as ready for everyday use. So it's still beta, still has a while before it'll be finalized, but they're basically presenting it as stable and ready for people to generally use. So if you haven't checked it out, it's probably a good time to do so, especially if you're a developer, because you will end up supporting it with your applications. And then just to mention Safari 13, I was actually thinking it might come out by now, but it hasn't, but it'll probably come out in the next few weeks. So we'll have more to talk about later on that. But if you are interested in what's coming, you can always check out the release notes. So they do have the beta 3 available for download if you haven't checked it out and you're interested. All right, so a few sort of libraries and frameworks. How many people have used Dojo before? How many people were actually developing when Dojo 1 came out in 2004? I was. I said it's one of the OG frameworks. It really was. It predates jQuery, I believe, or it came out right around the same time as jQuery. It was one of the first, it's the first one I remember that sort of had nice, rich widgets that you could actually use to build forms and build real applications. It kind of sucked, honestly, but at the time, it was great because everything sucked back in 2004, right? I mean, it was hard to build web apps back then. They're still around. They got acquired by IBM at some point a long time ago, but obviously they're still supporting it. Version 6 just came out. Honestly, I don't know much about the specifics of that stuff because I don't use it, but it sounds like no one here uses it either, so we don't have to dwell on that. But it is kind of a cool framework, and I have a soft spot in my heart for it because it's been around for so long. Rails 6.0, I bet a few of you probably are more familiar with Rails. They just had a really major release. I won't go through the features. The one thing I thought was kind of interesting about this is that GitHub is actually a Rails application, which I did not realize. And they had been running the pre-release version of this for months now. And there's a blog post on GitHub's blog that within a week of this going final, they had converted their entire code base over in production to running it. So that's quite a testament to Rails 6 and all the work that went into that. It's pretty impressive. Relay 6. So if you're not familiar with Relay, I'm sure probably you've heard of React. You may be familiar with GraphQL, which is a graph database. Relay is React's kind of layer that helps bind GraphQL to make it really easy to use with React applications. So it's basically a layer. Maybe, I don't know if it's similar to Fauna or not. Maybe you can touch on that. But it's basically a way to kind of make your app fully reactive without you having to do imperative calls to your database to load up data. So they just came out with a major version of that, mainly around supporting the new features of React, like hooks and suspense. And just a note, if you are using it at all, there are breaking changes, so be aware. Java 13. I'm not a big Java person since a long time ago. I think I was on JDK, maybe version 2, the last time I wrote Java code. So I don't know much about the features, but if you're in the Java world, definitely good to know about that this release came out. They're actually on a 6-month release cycle now, which is interesting. So for years and years, especially after Oracle bought Java, kind of languished and they weren't really doing much with it. But in the last couple of years, they've sort of accelerated the pace, and now they've been releasing frequently, which is cool. How many people have heard of Dark? Not many, 2 people. So this could be nothing, or it could be a very impactful thing in our industry. Either way, it's something interesting for you to check out if you haven't seen it yet. Normally, these kinds of things come out and they're sort of interesting, and then you never hear about them again. This one is one of the co-creators is the guy who co-founded Circle CI, which was very successful. Also, it has a pretty impressive list of backers behind it financially. And they just came out of kind of stealth mode basically this week. And it's really hard to explain fully what it is. And if you're interested, I would encourage you to check out the blog post, which links to a demo. They have a 10-minute walkthrough where they basically, the other co-founder builds a fully functional back-end application in 10 minutes. So of course, there's tons of demos and all kinds of things where you build something in 10 minutes. But it's actually pretty interesting if you watch it. For the most part, she's not writing code by hand. So it's sort of like infrastructure and an editor and the language all bundled in one. And it sort of connects things. There's a lot of magic behind it, I guess you can say that. So again, that's good or bad. You know, we've had that promise before with things like Meteor, which kind of, it's still around, but it, you know, no one's using it. We'll see what happens with it. But if you haven't checked it out, you should at least check out the demo. It's pretty cool. Security. How many people use Sequelize? Are there any Node developers here? A few. Sequelize is a very popular ORM in the Node space. So they discovered an injection, a SQL injection vulnerability. Luckily, it was disclosed responsibly and fixed before it was publicly, you know, announced. But just FYI, if you are using that in your project, you should definitely upgrade. So more disturbingly, I would say, is this example, which there's a popular package in Ruby, which is basically the common REST client that I guess a lot of people use in Ruby. The account of one of the maintainers of that project actually got hacked. And for a period of like 5 or 6 days, that package was serving with a backdoor that was going to a paste bin that was then executing code remotely from a Ukrainian domain. And I don't know if anyone actually figured out exactly what it was doing, but the best guess, I think, was that it was a crypto miner. What, did you say something? Oh. So again, if you happen to have been affected or you're not sure, go home and upgrade that as soon as possible. And just our reminder that we give all the time at the meetup when we talk about stuff like this, please use good passwords. Please vary your passwords. Please use two-factor authentication. Some industry headlines. How many people saw this? The guy that did the NPM advertising experiment. So I'm not going to talk about all this. There was a lot to it, and I linked to a bunch of stuff. These slides are online. I actually thought it was pretty interesting. So the guy that did it, if you don't know him, he's actually been around for a long time. He's a super well-known open source guy. He's written tons of open source packages that lots of people use. So he's a legitimate guy. He's not a rando that just did this to kind of piss people off. And if you read his writing about it, it was really, I think, a legitimate experiment to try to push the conversation forward around how NPM, or not NPM, how open source contributors can sort of have a sustainable lifestyle and do full-time open source. Obviously, it still pissed a bunch of people off. It pissed off NPM, so they kind of made a change to make it not possible. And I linked to this postscript. Like a few days later, NPM basically made this announcement that said, hey, we're actually working on solving this problem too. And I think next week they said they're going to have some announcement about like a product that they're planning for, you know, somehow paying open source people or whatever. Anyway, there was a lot of drama. Check it out if you're interested. All the links are there. If you missed this news, GitLab just raised 268 million bucks. They had actually just raised 100 million a year ago. What cracked me up about this is that was actually the title of their press release. So new funding for that much amount, for that amount, will allow us to enhance monitoring and security capabilities. And I was thinking, wow, what are they going to do with $268 million to just add monitoring and security? I was like, you know, pay me half of that and I'll install Datadog for you or whatever you're going to do. Like, Okay. But anyway, interesting news. If you don't recall, GitHub actually cashed out to the tune of about $7 or $8 billion. They got acquired by Microsoft last year. So definitely seems like a good time to be in Git hosting these days, I guess. This was pretty cool. So probably some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with graph databases in general. I mentioned GraphQL earlier. Neo4j is this company that specializes in that as well. There's actually a new ISO standard called Graph Query Language. So GQL is actually the first ISO standard for database languages since 1987, since the original SQL standard came out. So I thought that was pretty cool. If you've been skeptical about GraphQL and sort of, it's been like a buzzword for a while, but if you haven't checked it out, it's actually an ISO standard now. So it's probably a good time to take it seriously. How many people heard about Richard Stallman? This guy. Oh, not many. Interesting. So Richard Stallman has been around for a long time, like since the 60s and 70s when he first started. He's kind of a crazy dude to begin with. He's the guy that basically pioneered the whole free software movement, which is like religiously anti-commercial software. So he wrote the first version of GNU, the operating system, which has no licensed software in it at all. He authored the GPL license, which is very much along the same line. So on Monday, he got himself fired because he basically made comments in support of Jeffrey Epstein, which I'm not even going to get into that. It's kind of insane. And apparently now that that's come out, there's a whole history where apparently he's sort of like this anti-woman misogynistic jerk. So, don't care to get into the details of it, but it's actually a noteworthy thing because this guy has been decade after decade a very powerful force in free software and kind of licensing in lots of areas. So it was very noteworthy. In case you missed it, Google kind of quietly announced this. For years and years, we've had this rel equals nofollow attribute that you can use on anchors in HTML. And that basically means that the anchor is linked and humans can click on it and follow the link, but it's a hint to Google and other crawlers that that link is not intended to be followed for indexing purposes. And so what that means is that even though you're linking to another page, you're basically not endorsing the content of that page in any way. You're not telling Google that you should attribute any value to that link, basically. That's been around since 2005. They've just added 2 new values for that. So you can explicitly now say that this link is going to sponsored content, or this link is specifically some sort of user-generated content, so most commonly comments or user-generated forum posts, which is kind of interesting. So I guess Google can still index that, but it gives Google signals about how to handle it and maybe how to treat it differently, what weight to give it, that kind of thing. And then this came out, web-based version of iTunes. So again, iTunes itself, is not that interesting, but it was kind of notable for the technologies that they used. So it was built on Ember.js, which is kind of interesting. So that's a JavaScript framework that has been around for a while that a lot of developers are used to, but it's not something you would expect Apple to just adopt and use. They've also apparently embraced web components, which is a standard we've talked about a lot here. It's one of those things that a lot of people, it's kind of interesting, but we've all been waiting collectively for someone to really do it in production in a real way. Well, Apple just did that, which is pretty cool. And then they used this Stencil framework that's been around for a while. So interesting that they kind of got outside of their typical not invented here thing and actually used some open technologies. And if you missed it, COBOL, the language, turned 60. So in 1959, it was created originally by a woman named Mary Haas. More people commonly associate Grace Hopper with it because she, I think, wrote a lot of applications and kind of popularized it. It was designed to read like English, and it was the first true kind of interoperable computer language. So nowadays, of course, we take all that for granted. But 60 years ago, kind of it all started, so that was pretty interesting. Now, something completely different. Retro Swiper. So this person, it's kind of actually funny when you go to the GitHub and read the motivation. It's the thinnest of excuses, which is the best kind from developers, where he's like, I just got tired of all the mess. Like normally when you want to run old games, you have to download some emulator thing and figure out how to get it all installed. And he was like, yeah, I just want to put it all on a magnetic swipe card so I can just swipe my game anytime I want to. Definitely a problem that did not need to be solved, but he solved it. The other notable thing is it's actually written in Rust. So, if you're interested in checking out some real Rust code, that's a good one. And then finally, on the lighter side, how many people are familiar with XKCD, the comics? If you're not, it's actually really good. You should check it out. I linked to my favorite one of all time, which is this one. And you'll only get it if you know Unix. Make me a sandwich. What? Make it yourself. Sudo, make me a sandwich. Okay. I love that one. So that's XKCD. And where's my browser? Come back. Oh, come on. Did I kill it? Sorry. I think I killed my browser. Trying to get all fancy. But it was worth it, right? For the XKCD. All right. So the whole point of that slide was not that comic, but if you like that style, there is now a charting library just for you. So you can actually build charts, and you can see this is sort of a little animation, but they're in the drawing style of the guy Randall Munroe that draws XKCD. So again, another problem that you may not have known that you have, but if you do have that problem, that you need that style of charts, now you have the solution. And that's it for me. So thanks, and I'm going to turn it over to Corey now.
All right, hopefully it'll stay on here. Okay, so over the last couple of weeks, really, I've been working with GitHub Actions, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's in beta right now. It's a new service that GitHub has, along with a couple of other cool things. They've got a package registry now and sponsorship. So some kind of cool things coming out of GitHub. But GitHub Actions are interesting and kind of near and dear to me because they're focusing on automating workflow, which you'll see a lot of similarities to things that you're used to using. But before I dive into it, I noticed something here in putting these slides together. So workflow here, you can read this crazy definition, right? It's I'm not gonna read it, but basically, in a nutshell, it's how you get things done. And I very specifically chose this slide because, out of curiosity, how many people have been to this meetup at least one time in the last year, other than this event? Last 2 years? 3? 4? Okay, so Ted may know this, maybe not. In 2014, I gave a talk in that room called CustomizeYourWorkflow.js. Same definition, same stuff here, same slide. And the point that I'm trying to make in showing you this is that for years now, developers have been wanting to use things like JavaScript for build processes. And GitHub has finally put something together. I mean, we've seen it. You're going to see it in the rest of this presentation, things like Travis CI, Circle CI, all those kinds of things, and you can use any language you want. But the point is that there's been this emphasis around JavaScript for a very, very long time. So now if I can get out of this one. So that said, what we've seen since then, we've seen things like Travis CI and Circle CI and AppVeyor and CodeShip, and some of you may use Jenkins internally on premise. All of these kinds of things, it is possible to replace with GitHub Actions. The big difference is that since it's directly integrated into GitHub, if you're using GitHub for your code, it can make the process significantly more streamlined, a lot smoother. In a nutshell, it's basically running processes and responses to events. So think about like push, commit, pull, really anything that you could set up a webhook for, you could also set up a GitHub action for. Now, out of curiosity, has anybody used these before? Anybody else in the beta? No? Okay. All right. So this first one may not be as relevant then. Because it's in beta, they started with HCL for defining the format, the configuration. It really didn't go over all that well. So now they're using a YAML configuration, which is very similar to how you would set something up in a CI service. It's also built on Docker. And the beauty of that is really you can create actions in any language you want with essentially any operating system you want. So some kind of cool stuff there. But to make it more accessible, they've also created a number of templates, and Node is the most popular one right now that they've been working on, and that's actually what I'm going to show here tonight. So this is an action called AutoTagger that I put together a little while ago. The concept here is fairly simple. Show of hands, who uses Node or at least package.json? Okay, I expect, yeah, most people. So now you're not necessarily always releasing, but one thing that I've noticed is whenever I change a version, so you change the version number in your package.json file, I typically prefer to release a tag or a new release. I get tired of having to go out and do that manually, so I made this action that will essentially when your package.json file, when that version number changes, it will automatically create a new tag and it will generate a commit log for you from whatever has changed, so whatever's committed in your repo. So that's the general idea here, is to just trigger a new tag. For more practical purposes, up so that it will then publish to NPM or publish wherever I need something to go. So there's a lot of points here that you can touch on. And this marketplace that GitHub has, whoops, I clicked on the wrong one. There are a fair number of actions in here so far. So check it out. It might help with your workflow. These things can just be plugged in and run pretty quickly. And let's see. So that's said, the action itself, you can see the code here. This particular one, actually, let me make that a little bit bigger. All right, so this one's basically just saying on a push to master, run this job. There's two key components here. The checkout here, because most projects, and this is something that caught me a little bit the first time I ran an action, is you actually have to check out your project if you want it to run off of your code base. It's all integrated, so it's not hard. You just have to remember to add this step. Otherwise, if you try to run your action, you're like, where's my code? There's nothing there, because it's literally the same as logging into your machine and saying git pull or git fetch and pull to get your code. So it's an important step. And then this tag will run. This action will run as a response to that in order to generate the the actual tag. So that's how you would set something up. And I'm going to show that in. I have a test repo here. So this is the UI that you can see, and it looks fairly similar to a lot of other CI/CD services. So fairly simplistic stuff in here. Again, it's just generating a tag, but the point is that there's a UI that you can check out. You can get into debugging and things like that. So if you're creating your own custom tags, because you don't actually have to publish these, by the way, you can create your own tags and run them off of any repository that you feel like, including, I believe, private repos are supported. So the point is that you can get as complex or as simple as you like. There is a library here. I'm going to show you the actual code that you would use to actually create the action now that you've seen what it looks like and what the output actually is. And actually, I didn't show the output. The output is you can see here I've got a number of different tags, and I'm going to go ahead and actually change this so that you can see. So I think the last tag in here was 1.0.0.alpha3. So let's bump that. Whoops. Let's bump that to version 4. So I'm only making a code change. I'm only committing a single file here. Hopefully we'll catch it. All right, so it's running at the moment. So that triggered the actual action here. Like I said, it's running Docker, so it's going out and setting up everything. It's downloading the images that you need, and then it's outputting the values. So here you can see it says I created the new tag. It gives you a reference to everything. And so let's go check that out and see if it... So now when we look in our list, now there's that new tag there, and that was just because made a change to the package.json file. So again, the point here is that the workflow is simple, because once this is set up, you just kind of work and go. You don't have to worry too much about tagging things. It's more of breaking it down in your head and saying, am I ready to release something, and then make your change on the version. And again, this is a fairly simplistic action, but you can set things up to do it any way that you want. So the last thing that I'll cover here is how do you actually write one of these. So here is the code. Whoops, I'm sorry, wrong repo. All right, so at a high level, this is there's a template, like I said, that there are several node modules that you can use. It's actually it's github.com/actions, and you can see all the different libraries that they provide to try to help get you started very quickly. But in a nutshell, it uses newer syntax. I am not a big fan of TypeScript, but they do. That's actually what TypeScript is their default template. So I modified a little bit here, but at the end of the day, you can see there's a number of different things in here. I mean, it's all cool. Let me see if I can find something interesting. I think a couple of the key things are they have like this core debug feature here. You can output stuff that won't show up when you run the function unless you add an actual debugger flag. So the point is that I've actually, in fact, there have been a couple of issues with this particular action, and some folks have been submitting issues and showing me what's going on, and it was great to just be able to go in and say, hey, let's turn on the debugging, and now you can see exactly where things are failing. And that's, if you go and look at how to write these through the GitHub documentation, you'll see that it's a little bit convoluted, so these libraries are kind of nice because it saves you a lot of time and it just works. So really, there's only one other key feature here, and that would be these bits of code. So here we're setting output. This is the result of the action because, again, actions can be chained together. So in this case, I'm putting out tag names and the SHA, the URI, and a message. So that if you did want to use this in a downstream action, you could. So you can take in anything you want. You can output anything that you want. And it's that's really about all there is to actions in general. So fairly straightforward stuff. Once you get through just the fact that the documentation is still, it's not perfect right now. It's definitely coming along. It's beta, so you can see there's updates, there's links to old documentation, things like that. But if you happen to be a Node developer, or if you just kind of understand these concepts in general, should be pretty straightforward. So that is about it. But I did have one other little special announcement here, kind of going back to the workflow thing, because again, as I was putting this together, just seeing all these things from several years ago was a little bit serendipitous because back in 2014, I had announced a little project called Phoenix Web Server. It was version 2. Since then, it's generated 90,000 users, and I happened to launch the third version of that yesterday. So I'm only mentioning that because a lot of folks that have come to this meet have heard me talk about this a lot. So it's here. It's available for Mac and for Windows now, finally. Check it out. Let me know. So just kind of a little side note there, but it's been fantastic for workflow. And yeah, so that's about it. So I'll hand it over to Ted here. You don't need this, right? Okay.
It says ACL is in use. Let's see here. You said this one.
It should. Oh, it's because Brian's on it.
It's not letting me switch here. Should just take me off when you do it. AirPlay code. 6752. Oh my gosh, we have a screen. Okay, so for the past month, I've been working with Cosmos DB on Azure. It's an interesting experience because I think the way that Microsoft has set stuff up is it's globally distributed, so it's at all their data centers. You can tie into it and it syncs across all their data centers. You pay for it syncing, but it really is a REST API, but the type of data or the backend that you use is different depending on how you set it up. So it does lots of stuff and it has different models underneath. So it is a globally distributed multi-model database as a service. Ta-da. Multi-model. So the core item supports JSON and SQL. It's using parts of SQL Server, like some of the query engines is using it, but it's mapped into JSON in a pretty interesting way. I've done a lot of work on Dynamo, and coming from Dynamo to at least the core side of Azure has been interesting because it allows you to have pretty rich, deep documents, whereas you used to have flat documents. I think that's changed on Dynamo, but the other backends are MongoDB is supported, Cassandra storage is supported, tables are supported for kind of KV store stuff, and then Gremlin it's basically a GraphDB engine. So it's sort of like once you get the client working, you're querying it differently, and you can store different backends and the like. But I'm only going to talk about JSON and SQL. That's it. So in their hierarchy of how they define things, you create a database, and then you create containers within that database. And the container is where you store your items. And each container has different names, and you simply have that hierarchy. You can do joins between containers. So that's been a subject. I know it's fairly recent, but you can write SQL that joins two containers together and basically get results. In my experience, I found the actual queries are extremely fast. You're talking about like single-digit millisecond response times on stuff. And the reliability has been, it works. And it works really, really well. We've been doing it to store properties and other related stuff, but we're getting into kind of deeper documents. So I wanted to walk you through how the Node client works and the libraries and such. So this is basically an insert, but before I do this, I have to go create the actual containers. So I need to go create meetups and people as containers. hold on one second. Let me turn this up because I can't see it. There we go. So if I go to Dynamo, no. Okay. So I create new container, and I'm going to create it in the database Bleeding Edge. So meetups. And then the partition key is, it's a key that denotes the ID, and it creates an initial index on that item. You can create other indexes on the items to basically improve query performance. But by majority, just like Dynamo, you sort of pick your cost. So you're picking how performant are the queries that come back, and it's basically done on a units of RUs. In my working with it, I think we spent at least a week before we hit $1 in cost. So like, it's quite ridiculous in terms of how much it costs. But as you add kind of global redundancy, the costs go way up. And also at volume, you need to have enough RUs, like queries cost RUs and writes cost RUs. And there's also an underlying cost of, I think it's 25 cents a gigabyte. But I mean, a gigabyte of table is not, well, it's actually fairly large in JSON. So let's create this one. So we add one container. So we've created meetups. And then we're going to create another one called people. And the partition key for people is ID as well. And you'll see what those mean, because it's essentially the JSON that you stuff in has to have a unique identifier as a string passed in for that unique ID. And then we'll go back to Node. Let's see here. Back to Node. So essentially, I'll import my CosmoDB client, my Cosmo client, from the Azure Cosmos library. And I'm using a UUID just to generate unique keys. And I basically import those from the environment. So I have my keys in my environment. I'm pulling them in. And then I just create a Cosmo client using the keys that I've imported. And it really is a REST endpoint and a key. And I believe it uses, the library itself uses Node Fetch for any of the querying of the actual service. So it's pretty light on dependencies in terms of a library, but and then kind of creating references here, I'm using Cosmo client and then saying the database I want is Bleeding Edge and the container I want is Meetup. So I have kind of a handy reference for any type of queries or adding data. And then we get into kind of, how you would insert things. And when you insert things, it's really, I'm using an async function here. I'm passing in a JavaScript object. And I'm simply doing await people items create and then passing the data in. And that's really how you inject a data object, just a JavaScript object, into the database. That does the call. It's fully await compatible, so you can use it fairly easily. And here I do people, and here I do meetups. And then I would simply, here's a meetup object. I'm going to call my insert meetup, and I'm just going to pass in this large JavaScript object with inner arrays and numbers and strings and the like. I'll do it a couple times. And then, so that's the last 4 meetups for this group. But then I also have an array with people. So people IDs, just generate some UUIDs for those. And there's Brian, there's me, there's Corey. And then map it to insert people. And it's just going to run through the array and just stuff people in. And so let's just run that. Insert, done. There you go. So all the databases, it's in the record, it's in the database, and all that's done. Just to make sure I'm not cheating here, I just created these. So if I hit refresh, hey, there are the records. Hey, here are the IDs. Let's see here. Oh, that doesn't work very well. But as you can see, the JavaScript object is in here as JSON. It does add additional tags, more for their own use and for inner mapping. So there's some extra properties. They're all denoted with underscores when you actually add the data in. So this is meetups, and then in people, we can go into the items and take a look. And There are people in there as well. So ID, first name, last name. But any depth, any size, you're just paying a small amount for storage. And then on the query side, we can do something fairly similar. So on query, most of this boilerplate above, so the connection string is the same, the environmental variable is the same, the client's the same, the references to the actual client. I'm only going to be using meetups here. So I wrote this generic. It's probably terrible, but there is no concept of SQL insert. So there's no insert or delete tags in the supported SQL language. It's purely for selects. And so in that case, you can't really do an SQL injection since you can't edit the data. You can't do an insert. You have to do the insert through the API, and then you're purely querying through SQL. So in this case, I'm pushing in SQL directly into the calls and say execute this. And the SQL here is select distinct. And the way they do it is, since you know what container you're talking to, they denote the container as just generic name C. And so to select distinct title, C title, from, and attendees, C attendees, from C. And that attendees would be the count. And then the second one here is select C.title and C.attendees from C, where attendees is greater than 100. So you can get into where clauses and other related stuff, but we'll run the first one and just get the output. So query, and ta-da, here comes back an array. These are all the items we added, and it's only bringing back the properties that I asked for. It's bringing back title and attendees. So you can actually shape the JSON that you want back. Regardless of what's stored, you can control what the output is. And in that sense, it's fairly nice. But you can also do this one. So query where, this is where we're limiting it to attendance was over 100 people. And so it limited to attendees at 120 and attendees at 125. But again, the response times are, inside of 10 milliseconds. And when you're on the network, that speed is very nice to have from an app point of view. We found it's very nice for things where we're working a lot with queues and moving data around. And so it's very nice for temporary data storage where you just want to keep a bunch of records around and then occasionally drop them or delete the instances you don't need. We'll queue up a bunch of stuff, look at sort of suspended tickets or other types of data. We'll queue them up there and then just dump the data out as needed. So, but that's it. It's been a pretty good experience, and it's actually pretty easy to work with from a JSON point of view. The API is pretty clean and it's pretty fast. So that's it. So thank you.
Hello. Thanks everyone for coming out. Excited to tell you a little bit about Fauna, myself, what I do there, how we're cool, etc. I am Lewis King. I'm a senior product manager. Thank you for the pictures. At Fauna, we are a database company that I will get into in a little bit. So I'm not going to give another intro now. But to tell you a little bit about what we're going to cover today, we're going to start with Hello Fauna, go over the Jamstack. Does anyone know what the Jamstack is out there? Awesome. Yeah, me too, as of like a month ago, but now I know. And then do a little tutorial that I think will be really interesting to the audience, and then go over some metrics at the end. Yeah, and the goals of this talk, get to know Fauna, learn about the Jamstack, learn how to legitimately spot tech trends early to get away from just noise on the internet, and to learn the important analytics and data metrics for developers. So, an intro about me. Yeah, I'm currently a senior product manager at Fauna. Before this, I was at Telligent Data, a company I co-founded for 4 years. We built data products for other startups, specifically like data engineering pipelines. So I know a lot about that stuff. Before that, I was doing analytics at a gaming company, which was really fun. And before that, I was in consulting and getting an engineering degree. Yeah, so a little bit about Fauna. We're essentially, one of the terms that's been used is like a NoSQL database. It's like all of the NoSQL kind of benefits of flexibility with the added benefits of something like a SQL database that's very relational. And we actually completely guarantee, we're the only NoSQL database that completely guarantees an ACID transaction. So that's globally guaranteed, which is pretty cool. And we are branding ourselves, and I believe that we are, the world's #1 serverless database. So serverless being you don't have to worry about, it's like taking the cloud approach and taking it one step further. So you don't have to worry about provisioning any servers or EC2 instances or anything else in the cloud. You just focus on building your app. It's really nice. So a little bit about Fauna and the Jamstack. So the Jamstack is JAM. So this is JavaScript, APIs, and markup language. And it's a way to simplify your app. It's if you've heard of companies like Netlify, anyone heard of Netlify out there? A few more, or Zeit, or Prisma, or Apollo. These are all kind of Jamstack ecosystem companies, along with Fauna, who believe in the approach to programming on the web of being more kind of lightweight and more front-end focused. And yeah, starting with Jam here. Essentially, we send pre-built markup pages to the CDN, or Content Delivery Network, and then use client-side JavaScript to call APIs. And it allows you to use GraphQL everywhere. So there's already been some GraphQL talk tonight, which is really cool. As was mentioned, it's like the first like new standard that's been related to database languages since SQL in the late 80s. So we kind of believe it's here to stay. And Fauna is the only NoSQL database that I'm aware of that has like native GraphQL capabilities, which is great. Because the database is often the bottleneck of apps, and we allow people to interact with it with GraphQL. And as I mentioned before, we have distributed ACID transactions, which is it's really interesting because Fauna is like a kind of technical data product, but also it empowers developers who don't want to think about databases at all to just use GraphQL. So it kind of services both audiences at the same time. And we are globally available now. The solid regions are where we're currently deployed. We just launched in Southeast Asia and in Brazil, so we're up to 4 continents now. More to come on Azure, which is exciting. And a quick FaunaDB example, in case you haven't figured out exactly what Fauna is yet. So an example app that uses Fauna that's also a fully Jamstack app is very simple, justnotes.io. One of our wonderful engineers, Bruno Quaresma, actually wrote this in like a weekend side project, but it's essentially just an encrypted notes app that uses FaunaDB as a backend and uses GraphQL to communicate. Yes, and you can try Fauna for free. Super generous free tier. Highly recommend you check it out. Before I forget, we're also definitely hiring, so check out the jobs page if this stuff kind of sounds interesting. And we have a bunch of stickers in the back. Please grab them because there's like enough for each person to have 4 or 5, I think. So go for it. Don't hold back. Okay, so this is the part that I'm really excited about. Everyone take like 5 seconds to like take a breath, stretch if you need to, stand up. It's like one of those now it's time for something totally different moments. So yeah, no one really stretched, but we'll go with it. Okay, thank you. Yes, so this is a tutorial about measuring tech trends over time, and it's only tangentially related to what we do at Fauna as a core database product, but very related to my role as a product person at Fauna and somebody who, well, we don't have any dedicated analysts, and that used to be my full-time life, so I'm also the analyst. And essentially what happened here was our CMO asked, what is the, well, we'll get to the question. Yes. So how can we validate our assumption that serverless architecture is a growing trend? Because we were kind of betting a lot of the company's kind of strategy and approach on this whole serverless thing, which I talked about a minute ago. And we didn't really have kind of a quantitative answer to this fully. We had heard some anecdotal evidence. We knew people were innovating in this space, and it makes sense that people don't want to worry about servers, but how can we prove it? So the problem that I just described, Twitter would be a normal place to say like, hey, what's happening in the tech world? My really bad PowerPoint X shows that this is not a valid source for this because Twitter does not allow access to their full fire hose of data, and there are some companies that charge an arm and a leg for getting that data. So I thought about other sources and ones that would be more of like a definitive movement in the space regarding code as opposed to just like tweeting about something and talking about it. And so I came to the Stack Overflow and GitHub for this. And perhaps you're asking, but how do I query these sources? Those are companies that are private or acquired, and they probably don't give away their information for free. But it's free, you dingus. It actually is free. And the first place you can find this is data.stackexchange.com. For Stack Overflow, they actually release a ton of free data that anyone can just go and write queries against. And so getting into the SQL weeds a little bit, this is the query that I came up with to find posts that were like serverless. And digging into this a little bit, how's SQL comfort out there? Any intermediate SQL people? Advanced? Okay, great. Yeah, I think we'll be good. So yeah, essentially this first part of the select statement here, concat, this whole thing just basically turns the timestamp into a date that Excel or Google Sheets can use. And then count1 is just a common SQL shorthand to get all of the different mentions or records. And then this is the really important part, and it relates to a free treat I have at the end of this talk. But this part here that says where title like serverless locates all the different posts that serverless are mentioned anywhere in the title. And you can actually, okay, so the secret is I give you some, like a free repo at the end. You can go and, query to your heart's content. But you can replace serverless with anything that you want to analyze. So if you're curious about like GraphQL, or if you're curious about COBOL, see if that's like a growing trend these days, you can just go ahead and type like COBOL and you'll get the exact same result. And then this is a standard group by clause right here. Okay, and this is why it matters, because you can see that starting at the beginning of 2016, the Stack Overflow mentions really skyrocket from 0 to 60. I think this is per day. Yes, so you can see that this is definitely a growing trend, or so it seems. But you don't only want to take one source. So I then came to the decision to query GitHub as well. GitHub is not, it's a little trickier to work with, and the first hint of that is this ridiculous URL, but this is part of the repo at the end, so don't worry about copying it down. But essentially GitHub also supplies a bunch of free and available data to query what their usage is. And it's a very similar query, But you'll notice that I have this really gnarly looking from statement where I'm doing this table date range function and across multiple timestamps. So let me describe what that is. So essentially the way that that GitHub has architected their open data in Google Cloud, which is in BigQuery, their querying interface, they essentially have each one of their archive tables as one day. And so this is essentially saying, let's select all of the different tables for each day from the first day of 2017 until June 1st, 2019. And I just learned about this function by looking it up. And note that the BigQuery actually limits the date range here to 1,000 days or tables. So if you want more than that, like I did, you either have to run separate queries or do a clever union. And then it's very similar. So I did a where repo.name like serverless. So I just wanted to see which repos had serverless in the name. And you can see it's a very, very similar trend to what we saw in Stack Overflow. So at the beginning or very end of 2015 into 2016, we have this huge spike. And at this point, I think this is an interesting chart. I forgot what the x-axis like days or weeks are, but the point is we're clearly growing and up to 30,000 repos now, which is really cool. Okay, and yes, you can go to github.com/lewisisgood/techtrends, and you can make your own, submit a PR. I just made this repo last night, but I'd love for someone to do an analysis and submit it to this repo. That would be really cool, or at least start or something like that. That would be great. And then a quick note on metrics, because I want this to be kind of useful for anyone in the room who's a developer, who's interested in data. Most of you who are still here probably are to a certain extent. And so this is asking a different question. So how can we validate our assumption that anyone likes or uses our product, as opposed to, what's an interesting trend? And so the reason we want to ask this question is because it's important to know how our app's doing, what features people like, why people are staying around, and if the app is performing well or not. And you, as hopefully data-driven developers, can start to analyze data yourself, create dashboards, spec out data logging, which is a common data analyst task that engineers can totally help with. And very importantly, probably most importantly, avoid extra meetings by being able to query data and send a chart and not have a meeting about it. So a few major categories of product metrics. We have revenue, engagement, retention, and funnels. Okay, so starting with revenue, there's a few different stats here, but essentially they're revenue-related stats. So first of all, daily active users, DAU, is a very common metric in the web world, and you often do revenue metrics by daily active user. So some example metrics would be revenue per day, average revenue per user, and per daily active user, and per paying user, because your paying users are often very important as well. And a quick note on whales, as you can see Shamu right here. Whales are very important in the web and gaming and all of that ecosystem. They're essentially your power users who are going to be the ones who are paying for the app and probably most opinionated about what happens in your app. So important to pay attention and do analysis for your whales specifically. In terms of engagement, these are things like average time per user per day, how long people are spending in sessions, and their number of sessions per day. And it's important to note that this differs wildly by app. In some apps, you may actually want to minimize the amount of time in your app. So I used to work in gaming, and for some of our games, people would have like 3-hour sessions per day and 2 sessions a day or something like that. But if someone's hanging out in your database like console for 6 hours a day, maybe something's wrong. Maybe you only want them there for like a minute every week because hopefully they're not having to visit it too often. So it's just something you need to think about. And then Aha, yes. One person understands the pain. So there's all sorts of retention metrics. A common one is D1R, or day one retention. This is the percentage of users who visit your app the day after they install or sign up as a new user. In a standard D1R, it could be anywhere from like 10% or 95%. And this can really be influenced by things like push notifications or kind of new user offers, things like that. And it's important to also look at retention by other time periods. So D7R, which would be like what percentage of users come back a week later, or D365R, which was we were looking at in gaming, which is how many people come back a year later. And these queries can be tricky to write. So this is an example query that I wrote recently at my company for week 1 for an 8 retention. Mostly included here to show how gnarly it can get. If you're interested in doing a retention analysis and don't want to write this, just let me know. Send me an email and I'll just send you this query. But you can essentially see that there's a lot of like case statements. There's a lot of casting. And yeah, it's just generally unpleasant, but these things do need to happen. Yeah, so for funnels, these are also really important. So if you think about new users coming into your application, and probably most of the people in this room work at companies that have users. So think about, let's just say 100 people go to your website. What percentage of them actually get through the initial kind of first minute or onboarding of your app? And you might be surprised at how the drop off here can be up to like 70 or 80%. And so doing little things like improving education during the onboarding, or giving them an offer, or just getting creative to try to improve the throughput of this funnel can be really meaningful, because it might mean the difference between 100 people coming to your app per day and 20 of them sticking around versus 95 of them sticking around. So I can't really stress enough how important funnel analysis is, and making sure that you have a new user experience that you can A/B test. Yes, and a quick note on analytics tools. So this is related to the question, how can we work with our product data? So a few important tools. We have SQL, which we've touched on today, Excel, visualization tools like Looker and Tableau, and we use Redash at Fauna, for example, and then Python, R, and scripting. So a quick note again about SQL. Data lives in databases. Data engineering teams create these databases, and PMs and analysts want to use that data. And SQL is really important. It's been around forever. I still use it every single day. It's kind of the prerequisite for all of these other analytics tools. And yeah, this is an example of data visualization software. This one is called Looker. I've used it at a couple companies. I'm sure some people have used Tableau before. Redash I used to not like, but we're using it again at Fauna, and it's growing on me. It's very simple. There's others like Mode. Yeah, there's a lot of them, but they all kind of have different price points and benefits. And that is all I prepared. Thank you so much for sticking around, for listening. I hope you learned about Fauna, and also about learning about tech trends and how to find them yourself. Are there any questions right now? Feel free to just shout them out or raise your hand. Yes?
I just like to compliment everybody on their spacing.
In the audience? Yes, everyone is very well spaced in the audience. I agree.
For the one GitHub repo account, it was going down sometimes. Is that the repos being deleted, or is that the number of repos being added over time?
Yeah, great question. So that was... to be fair, I did this analysis back in June, so it's not completely fresh. But yeah, so I was looking back up at the chart and wondering if it was a cumulative graph or not. And it wasn't, because it was going back down. At least that's what I think. So maybe the y-axis was off or something like that. But yes, it would only go down like that if repos were being deleted. Right. Yeah, what else?
I have a question about
Yes.
Fauna. I wanted to get more clarity on the positioning of Fauna in that sort of first Venn diagram that you showed. So like, how do you guys talk about yourselves in relation to like Mongo specifically or some of the other big names?
Yeah.
A little more detail on that.
Sure. So the question is a great one. It's learning about FaunaDB's positioning in the database space, especially relative to Mongo and some of the other ones. Yeah, so we're trying to be a really easy to use serverless database. Fauna's roots were actually in becoming like a really core enterprise level database, and we've since kind of pivoted to be more focused on developers in this new Jamstack paradigm, and we've already found like a lot of traction there. And so relative to something like Mongo, essentially, we kind of have these things that have been born out of our database products, that like the global consistency that I talked about. Mongo recently introduced transactions, but only on a per node level. Fauna is still the only one that has global consistency like that. And then there's other products out there like Google Firebase, for example. There's a few benefits. So if you take any of the like Amazon Aurora or Google Firebase, they're all like cloud provider specific, whereas FaunaDB is kind of more cloud provider agnostic and inherently serverless, so you don't have to worry about spinning up extra nodes or anything like that. All of that's handled behind the scenes. And we also are the only database to have like a formal add-on that's supported by Netlify, which is like Netlify is like a big ecosystem provider now. So a lot of people who use Netlify kind of default to Fauna because it's right there. You can just use it in the command line. And then finally, the piece of having the GraphQL as like native support, as opposed to using a third-party provider to work with GraphQL in your database. So that's a really nice benefit too.
When you say serverless, does it abstract things like clustering and sharding and some of the like infrastructure management of it, or do you still deal with that kind of stuff? Or what?
Yeah, so the question is, in terms of serverless, is it abstracting things like cluster management and sharding? And the answer is yes. So you don't have to worry about any of that. You don't have to worry about where your data is in the world or where it is on either cloud provider. We handle all of that. We automatically distribute data globally, and we have it across different cloud providers. In the instance, if like AWS is down, our data behind the scenes in Google Cloud will still be available for use in your app. And we're also getting very close to releasing some exciting features around data locality that will allow people in other kind of countries with very strict like GDPR or Privacy Shield concerns to not have to worry about that and essentially store data in specific zones to their liking. Yes.
So if it's, I'll just ask it this way: is there an on-premise type of solution? Like, if I wanted to run this in my own data centers, would I be able to take? Is that even a possibility?
Yeah, so the question is, can FaunaDB be run on-prem? And the answer is yes. We have a managed services department, and back when we were kind of a more enterprise-facing company, that was really important, and we branded that more. Since we've been kind of riding the Jamstack and the NoSQL or the Jamstack and the serverless wave, it's like been more of our focus to be on the clouds. But yeah, we can totally run locally and on-prem as well. Good question so far. Thank you. Yes, in the back.
I think you mentioned Azure, GCP, and AWS. You're redundant on all of those services? Or?
Yeah, so right now, the map's on our website, just on fauna.com, but we're redundant in at least 3 regions across the globe in AWS and Google Cloud, and we're releasing Azure very soon, as in weeks from now. Yeah. Of course. Yes. at this meetup? In London. Oh. Yeah, no, so that's an interesting point. Fauna is a fully remote company. We have employees all over the world. We actually don't really have an office outside of like WeWorks. And we do have somebody in London. So yes, and he's really brilliant. He knows a lot more about databases than I do. So he can go totally nuts on these type of questions. Yeah. Cool. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, nice. Thanks for the presentation. So yeah, thanks for coming out. We do have like 20 minutes. You can hang out if you have any more questions for anyone who spoke. You can come up and ask or just chit chat. And then, like I said, if anyone feels like having another beer or hanging out further, we'll probably go downstairs. But either way, thanks for coming out. Appreciate it. Oh, thanks. Yeah.